There is a particular kind of strength that lives in the ability to never crack, to never show the struggle, to never reveal the breaking points. The person who has learned this strength moves through the world with an unshakable exterior, composed, in control, untouched by the pain that touches everyone around them. They are the ones who do not cry, who do not ask for help, who handle everything alone, who stand steady while others fall apart. The world admires this strength. It seems like power. But behind the unmovable exterior is a quiet ache, a loneliness that deepens with each person they keep at a distance, a disconnection from their own body, from their own emotions, from the possibility of being truly known. And slowly, over years of maintaining this facade of invulnerability, something essential begins to atrophy. The capacity to feel diminishes. The walls that were built to protect become prisons, and the strength that once felt empowering begins to feel like a curse, a darkness that separates them from the very human connection their soul is starving for. Chapter 1: The Walls We Build. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from never allowing anyone to see the real you. The person has built walls, sturdy, carefully constructed barriers that keep the world at a distance. These walls appear as strength. The person seems unshakable, composed, in control. But inside, behind the unmovable exterior, there is a different reality, a reality of profound isolation. The walls keep everyone at arm's length. Relationships exist, yes, but only on the surface. The person shares information about their life, what they did that day, their work, their plans, but they do not share their actual inner world. They do not reveal their struggles. They do not admit to weakness. They do not ask for help. They maintain a distance that protects them from rejection, but also prevents genuine intimacy. What is striking about these walls is how exhausting they are to maintain. The person is constantly monitoring their emotional expression. They catch themselves before tears fall. They swallow the words that would make them vulnerable. They redirect conversations away from anything that might require emotional openness. This constant emotional labor, the work of staying armored, is relentless and depleting. The person who has built these walls often experiences a strange numbness. They are supposed to feel joy, but the joy is muted. They watch others cry at movies and do not understand. They listen to friends share their struggles and do not know how to respond. The capacity to feel deeply has become constricted, trapped behind the walls along with everything else. There is also a disconnection from the body. Because feeling emotions is dangerous, the person learns to disconnect from their body's emotional signals. They do not notice the tightness in their chest, the clenching in their jaw, the heaviness in their stomach. They have trained themselves to ignore these signals, to intellectualize rather than feel. Over time, this disconnection becomes habitual. They live in their head, cut off from the wisdom and information their body is trying to provide. The walls create a relationship with others that is fundamentally inauthentic. Because the person cannot be themselves, they are always performing a version of themselves. They are always curating what they show. They are always managing the impression they make. And while others might admire the composed person they see, that composed person is not real. The real person is locked behind the walls, unseen and unknown. Intimacy becomes impossible behind these walls. True intimacy requires vulnerability, requires being seen and known despite fear of rejection. But the person who has built impenetrable walls cannot allow this. So their relationships remain shallow. They have people in their lives, but no one who truly knows them. They have supporters, but no one to lean on. They appear strong, but feel profoundly alone. There is often a subtle shame that accompanies these walls. The person is ashamed of needing anything, ashamed of struggling, ashamed of the very human experience of pain, fear, and uncertainty. The shame tells them that if others could see the vulnerable parts of them, the parts that are scared, that doubt, that need, they would be rejected. So the walls must remain, the shame must be hidden. The real self must stay locked away. What is perhaps most tragic about these walls is that they are constructed to prevent pain, but ultimately guarantee it. The person avoids the temporary pain of vulnerability and instead experiences the chronic pain of isolation. They trade the risk of momentary rejection for the certainty of permanent disconnection. And they do not realize they have made this trade until years have passed and they have become strangers to themselves and to everyone who knows them. Chapter 2. The origins of impenetrability. The walls do not appear from nowhere. They are built brick by brick, layer by layer, in response to experiences that taught the person that vulnerability leads to pain. Often these foundational experiences occur in childhood, when the person was most vulnerable and most in need of safety. A parent who rejected emotional expression created the first foundation. A parent who punished vulnerability taught the child that feelings must be hidden. A parent who was emotionally unavailable left the child alone with their own emotions and taught them that no one could be trusted with their inner world. These early experiences created the blueprint. To survive, one must not feel. To survive, one must stay in control. To survive, one must never show weakness. For some, the walls are built in response to experiences of abandonment. A parent who left, a caregiver who was inconsistent, a sibling who betrayed. These experiences created a deep fear. If people see the real me, they will leave. So the walls went up as protection. If no one can see the real self, no one can reject it. If no one can get close, no one can abandon. For others, the walls are built in response to trauma, abuse, violence, violation. When the person was vulnerable, they were hurt. So vulnerability became associated with danger. The walls became necessary armor. They allowed the person to survive dangerous circumstances, but even after the danger has passed, the walls remain, still protecting against threats that are no longer present. Shame is often at the root of these walls. The person was shamed for their emotions, told they were too sensitive, too needy, too dependent, told their feelings did not matter. This shame created a belief. There is something wrong with me for feeling. So the feelings had to be hidden. The walls had to be built to contain the shameful emotions and keep them invisible. Cultural messages reinforce these walls. Boys are taught that real men do not cry. Girls are taught that being too emotional makes them weak or unstable. Everyone is taught that independence is strength and dependence is weakness. These cultural narratives provide a framework for building walls and equate emotional expression with weakness. Some people build walls because they learned early that their needs did not matter. A parent focused on their own struggles, too exhausted to attend to their child's emotional needs. A family in chaos where there was no space for individual feelings, the child learned, "My needs are not important. I must take care of myself and others. I cannot expect anyone to be there for me." So the walls went up as a necessary adaptation to emotional neglect. The walls are often reinforced by experiences in which vulnerability was used against the person. A confidence was betrayed. A weakness was exploited. An intimate moment was met with mockery. These experiences confirmed what the walls were built to protect against. Being vulnerable is dangerous. Being known is unsafe. So the walls became stronger, more rigid, more impenetrable. What is important to understand is that these walls were not chosen by the person. They were not a conscious decision to be distant or removed. They were a necessary adaptation to an environment that made vulnerability unsafe. The walls served a purpose. They helped the person survive. But what once was protective has become imprisoning. Chapter 3: The Neurobiology of Disconnection. The chronic practice of emotional walls does not just create psychological isolation. it creates measurable neurobiological changes. The brain that is trained to never show vulnerability, to never connect, to remain always in control, undergoes a transformation at the cellular level. Social isolation, which is what chronic emotional walling creates, triggers a stress response in the body. The autonomic nervous system shifts into a state of threat. Cortisol and other stress hormones are elevated. The body remains in a state of physiological arousal, even though the threat is not external but internal. The threat of vulnerability, of being seen. This chronic stress has particular impacts on the brain. Myelin, the fatty insulation around nerve fibers that allows for efficient neural communication, begins to degrade. This degradation occurs particularly in regions involved in emotional regulation, social connection, and reward processing. As myelin breaks down, communication between these crucial brain regions becomes slower and less efficient. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation, shows reduced activity in chronically isolated individuals. Simultaneously, the amygdala, the threat detection center, becomes hyperactive. This imbalance means that the person becomes more reactive to perceived threats and less able to regulate their emotional response. The dorsal vagal response, part of the parasympathetic nervous system's protective mechanism, becomes the default mode. Rather than shifting between engagement and rest as a healthy nervous system does, the chronically walled-off person tends to remain in a state of shutdown, numbness, or disconnection. This is a protective response, but it comes at the cost of emotional aliveness. The reward systems in the brain also change. The nucleus accumbens, which processes reward in response to social connection, shows reduced activation in response to social stimuli in socially isolated individuals. This means that connection, which should feel rewarding, becomes less rewarding. The person loses the neurobiological incentive to connect, creating a vicious cycle in which isolation begets more isolation. The hippocampus, involved in memory processing and emotional context, shows altered volume and function in chronically isolated individuals. Memory itself becomes affected. The person's relationship to their own past becomes distorted. Trauma becomes more compartmentalized. Positive memories of connection become less accessible. The inflammatory markers in the brain increase. Chronic stress triggers inflammation that damages neural tissue. This inflammation contributes to cognitive decline, mood disorders, and reduced emotional resilience. Perhaps most significantly, the window of tolerance, the zone in which the nervous system can function optimally, becomes narrower. The person's nervous system can tolerate less stress, less emotion, less intensity before it shifts into dysregulation. Vulnerability, intimacy, and emotional expression become so overwhelming to the nervous system that they trigger fight, flight, or freeze responses. The good news is that the brain possesses neuroplasticity, the capacity to rewire itself based on new experiences. Studies in animals show that when social isolation is reversed and connection is restored, many of these neurobiological changes can be undone. The myelin can regenerate, the neural pathways can be rewired, the nervous system can learn new patterns. Chapter 4. The Paradox of Self-Protection. At the heart of never showing vulnerability lies a fundamental paradox. The belief that self-protection requires isolation, when in fact connection is what creates true security. The person who has built walls believes that vulnerability leads to pain, but what they experience is that their protection leads to loneliness. The person is trapped in a contradiction. They crave connection, but fear it simultaneously. They want to be known, but are terrified of being seen. They need intimacy, but have made themselves incapable of experiencing it. This contradiction is not a character flaw. It is the inevitable result of building walls in an attempt to protect themselves from a threat that, while real in their past, no longer exists in their present. Defense mechanisms maintain the walls. Intellectualization, turning emotional experiences into abstract thoughts, allows the person to discuss their feelings without actually feeling them. Dissociation, a numbing disconnection from the body and emotions, creates distance from the very sensations that would require vulnerability. Projection, seeing in others the feelings they cannot acknowledge in themselves, allows them to criticize in others what they fear in themselves. There is also often a need for control that reinforces the walls. By maintaining perfect emotional regulation, by never crying, by never asking for help, the person maintains the illusion of control. But this control is illusory. The person is not controlling their emotions. They are being controlled by their defensive structures. They are not strong, they are trapped. Perfectionism often accompanies these walls. The person believes that if they are perfect enough, composed enough, unaffected enough, they will be worthy of love and connection. But perfection is impossible, so they spend their lives trying to achieve an impossible standard, always falling short, always convinced that if people saw the imperfect, struggling, needing parts of them, they would be rejected. There is also often a guilt that accompanies the walls. The person feels guilty for not being able to be close to others, guilty for not being able to reciprocate emotional support, guilty for the distance they maintain. This guilt drives them to overfunction in other ways, to be perfect at work, to be the helper, to be the strong one, in an attempt to compensate for the emotional distance they maintain. The person resists opening up because opening up feels dangerous. Their body has learned that vulnerability is a threat. Their nervous system will activate a stress response if they attempt to be vulnerable. So they avoid situations that might require emotional openness. They avoid intimate relationships. They keep people at a distance. They work to prevent any situation in which they might need to be vulnerable. What the person does not realize is that this resistance itself is the problem. By resisting vulnerability, they are training their nervous system to see vulnerability as dangerous. They are reinforcing the neural pathways that maintain the walls. They are deepening the pattern rather than escaping it. Chapter 5. The cost becomes visible. The turning point often comes when the cost of the walls becomes too high to ignore. A relationship that could have been deep remains superficial and eventually dies because neither person is truly present. A family member reaches out and the person finds themselves unable to receive the gesture because accepting help would require acknowledging need. A person experiences a crisis and realizes they have no one to turn to because they have kept everyone at a distance. For some, the turning point comes through physical illness. The chronic stress maintained by the walls manifests as chronic illness, autoimmune disease, cardiovascular problems, or chronic pain. The body, which has been forced into a state of protective tension for years, finally breaks down. And in the breaking, the person realizes that the walls have been harming them, not protecting them. For others, it comes through a collapse of the facade. After years of maintaining perfect emotional control, something happens that cracks it. A loss occurs that cannot be intellectualized away. A rejection happens that cannot be denied. And in that moment, the wall crumbles and the person discovers both the terror of vulnerability and the strange relief of finally being able to cry. The turning point is often accompanied by a kind of grief. The person begins to see what their walls have cost them. Years of relationships that never went deep, years of isolation despite being surrounded by people, years of not allowing themselves to be comforted or held, years of carrying their burdens entirely alone. The grief is real, and it requires acknowledgement. There is often also anger at the people who taught them that vulnerability was not safe, anger at themselves for building the walls and maintaining them for so long, anger at the years that were lost to isolation, anger at having to now do the painful work of taking the walls down. but beneath the grief and anger is often a spark of hope. If the walls created the isolation, then perhaps removing the walls could create connection. If the emotional numbness came from the walls, perhaps removing them could allow feeling again. If the disconnection from the body came from the walls, perhaps removing them could create embodied presence again. Chapter 6. Dismantling the walls. Healing from a lifetime of emotional walls requires more than willpower or intention. It requires therapy, time, safe relationships, and deliberate rewiring of the nervous system and the patterns that maintain the walls. Attachment-based therapy is particularly effective because it directly addresses the root cause, the early relational trauma that made walls seem necessary. In the therapeutic relationship, the person experiences a new kind of relationship, one in which emotional openness is safe, in which vulnerability is met with compassion, in which being known does not result in rejection. The therapist becomes what is called a secure base, possibly the first one the person has experienced. In this secure relationship, the person can practice being vulnerable in small, manageable doses. They can cry, they can admit doubt, they can ask for help, and they can survive doing so. Somatic therapies are also crucial because the walls are not just psychological, they are stored in the nervous system and the body. Somatic approaches help the person reconnect with their body, recognize the signals it sends, and gradually teach the nervous system that vulnerability is not dangerous. Processing the traumatic memories that created the need for walls is essential. EMDR and other trauma processing approaches help the person revisit the experiences that taught them vulnerability was dangerous and update their nervous system's response to those memories. Building tolerance for vulnerability is a gradual process. The person might start by expressing a small need to someone they trust, then a slightly larger need, then a fear, then a shame. With each small act of vulnerability that is met with acceptance, the nervous system learns that vulnerability is survivable and can even lead to deeper connection. Chapter 7. The freedom of being seen. On the other side of the walls is a freedom that is difficult to describe to those still behind them. It is the freedom of being known, of being seen by another person, not the curated version, but the real self with all its complexity, vulnerability, and imperfection, and being accepted anyway. The walls, once removed, reveal a capacity for connection that had been dormant. The person discovers they can cry and survive it, they can express need and be helped. They can be honest about their struggles and have them met with compassion rather than rejection. They can allow someone to know them and be loved, not despite their vulnerability, but sometimes even because of it. The body, freed from years of protective tension, begins to relax. Chronic pain diminishes. Sleep improves. The nervous system, no longer in constant defensive mode, can move between engagement and rest as it should. The person begins to feel truly alive for perhaps the first time. Perhaps most importantly, the person discovers that the vulnerability they feared is not weakness. It is the foundation of genuine strength. True strength is not the absence of need. True strength is the ability to acknowledge need and ask for help. True strength is allowing oneself to be held and supported. True strength is the courage to be fully, authentically human. The walls do not disappear instantly. The nervous system does not rewire overnight. But with patient, consistent practice of vulnerability and connection, something profound shifts. The person begins to experience the fundamental human truth. We are not meant to be alone. We are meant to be known. And in being known, we discover that we are worthy of love, exactly as we are.